Now, I started with, today I called the lecture something like this. I don't have it in front of me. And then there were kings. So we're arriving at a point in the history of Israel as we move through a chronological trip through the story of ancient Israel, where something big really changes, right? We've dealt with background, we've dealt with this period of earliest Israel that the Bible treats in the book of Judges, that I call time without kings. But at some point, even when I called this early period time without kings, you know kings are coming. And so if you were to draw one big line down the middle of the history of Israel, you could say it's before kings and after kings. And there are other ways you could cut it. But so today is the first class for thinking about Israel with kings. And I wanted to get you thinking about this on the big scale. And here's how I wanted to start. I have a quote, which I just simply copied into my notes. This is a psalm. It's the beginning of Psalm 93. Don't need to put it up. I didn't even ask. Yahweh is king, or as your translation would have it, the Lord is king. Yahweh is king. He is robed in grandeur. Yahweh is robed. He is girded with strength. The world stands firm. It cannot be shaken. Your throne stands firm from of old. From eternity you have existed. This is how this poem begins. It's like a hymn, in effect. So here's my question, and I'll read the text one more time. But my question is, what do you learn about the world from these lines? What do you learn about the world from these lines? So let me read it again. I'm doing all this before I get to my class, sort of class goal for the day. Yahweh is king. He is robed in grandeur. Yahweh is robed. He is girded with strength. The world stands firm. It cannot be shaken. Your throne stands firm from of old. From eternity you have existed. What do you learn about the world? Take a shot at it. Yeah.
There are people that believe there's something high and mighty.
Okay, so that's an interesting. So she said, there are people who believe there's something high and mighty. So, I mean, this is true, right? And we've got a God, right? This is going to be this God, and you can say there are people who believe in God, but it's the high and mighty part that I'm really interested in. Because I say, when I ask, what can you tell about the world? Then that's, what can you tell about their world? Well, so they have the ability to think of something high and mighty. Can anybody sort of spin it out a little more? Yeah.
They don't believe that they're fully in control, and they don't believe they're ultimately the ones that are in control of them.
Okay, so that's interesting. The comment was they don't believe that they're the ones who are ultimately in control. That the way you put it the second time. So what does that mean? So if you have people who don't believe that they're ultimately in control, or people who believe in that there is something high and mighty, this is then what I'm pushing at, and we don't have to belabor it very long, but where does that go? I mean, is this just coming from a religious feeling that they look out in nature and they look at the sun or the stars or something and they say, the world is a really big place, I must be small? Like, does the language that I read just tell you that? I'm pushing for something else, right? You can tell, right? Yeah, go ahead.
Well, it's coming out of a time when there were no kings. So sort of by saying Yahweh is king, it's like if you don't have the actual government and everything set up, then you go to a higher power.
How do you know there? Okay, and it's actually, good to notice it says Yahweh is king, but you started by saying it comes out of a time when there were no kings. How do you know that? Well, I mean, if it comes out of a time when there were no kings, it would probably have to be actually after Israel or Judah fell. It would be because it's late, which is a good question. Nobody knows for sure. It's a psalm, in the book of Psalms. We don't know the dates for sure. They're associated with David, many of them. but what exactly? If anything, in fact, go ahead. Well, so this is the set of questions to start asking, right? So like either they have a king or they are certainly familiar with the institution. Like one of the things that was kind of a shock for me at some point when I was starting to study the ancient world, because I was a geology major as an undergraduate, just so you know. You think, wait a minute, what's he doing teaching us? So yeah, but I came late to all of this stuff. So, and I had no religious background. I didn't have anything. So there were times when I was studying and I thought, what? Like, where did that? I never knew that. So one of these moments for me was when I realized, the world did not always have kings. Does this sound really obvious? But of course, it's like when I realized that war had to be invented. Can you imagine that? Like war had to be invented, that the human species existed without war. It doesn't mean they didn't have squabbles or even occasionally kill each other or stuff like that. But they had to invent war. Like forts had to be invented. There was a time, if you go back in archaeology, where you find these large cities with no walls. Isn't that interesting? Kings had to be invented. So for now you think, well, wait a minute, we don't have kings anyway, right? Democracy had to be invented. But you can think if you go back to the ancient world, well, okay, now we have democracy, then we had kings, or they had kings, right? But no, they had to invent them, yeah, not just in Israel.
But didn't they have some sort of ruler over each person? If you want to say serfs and, some person that was always over someone else. It's not that it was inventing, it was always that way. There was always a hierarchy.
Well, so you could say that, right? I mean, this is one of the things I told someone that I was talking to today was, whenever you're trying to assert something, ask yourself what the alternative is. And you're kind of proposing an alternative. Well, I mean, you can ask if you go back in time, there can be sort of higher and lower status and stuff like that. But is that the same as a king? Like if your dad is the head of the household and you have a pretty hierarchical, patriarchal household, or maybe your mom is, I don't know. But like, is she the same as the king just because she tells you what to do? No, I mean, when you get to the idea of kingship, there's something more institutionalized in that. There's a larger level of complexity and hierarchy, and read Carol Myers, right? She's the chapter that you had for today, to talk about what some of those categories would be. And so, yeah, actually, yeah, I really like your idea that it's not like an all of a sudden sort of moment, but it's to realize that if you start going back in time, whether it's kings or war or defense against war or things like that, that the things we associate with kingship or war or things like that, just at a basic level, like an army, what's an army? They have to be invented. You have to get to a point where people create this and it gets institutionalized. They did not always exist, and they don't automatically exist. And so it's not as if it then happens just because it happens in one place, that everybody gets it instantly. And one of the interesting things about the Bible and its picture of Israel is that Israel in particular was kind of a latecomer to getting it. But so one of the things, there's this brilliant book by a guy named Torkild Jacobson called The Treasures of Darkness, which is a great title, about Mesopotamian religion. And one of the best idea in this book is that he's talking about the earliest evidence for religion based on writing, sort of historical evidence, and for not artifacts or things like that. And he says, he starts talking about the first period when the cosmos was portrayed as a kingdom, more or less, or a polity, like a political organization, because the gods in a polytheistic world didn't start this way. There was a sun god and storm god and river gods, and then there was birth goddess and goddesses of healing and all these different jobs. But these are not the same as having the gods ordered according to a ruler, a boss, who runs things and tells other gods what to do. And then in hymns, you would not have people praise a god by saying, "You're the king." In order to do that, you have to have the idea of kings, to go back to what you said, the idea of a sort of supreme power, but it's got to be part of your experience as a human, like not just in reaction to the powers of nature, say, or something. So this is by starting the class this way, I wanted you to begin with the notion that kingship is not automatic. It was not automatic to them. It's something that had to be invented. It's something that had to be born. It's something that had to grow, in another sense. But it was not always there. And so as we approach kingship for Israel, or even when you read, I mean, I picked a psalm, there's kind of New Testament Christian language for this, God is king, even when you say God is Lord, all this language, which is sort of standard monotheism language, is imbued with the images of monarchy. And I want you to realize that this is not automatic, that that's how you talk about God even. And so if you think, well, this king business, it's just politics and I'm not interested in politics, I'm more interested in religion. Well, at least when it comes to monotheism, if you want to understand Israel's God and how they thought about that God, then you better start thinking politics too, because it's part of the picture. And so today we're going to look at the politics. We're going to look at the appearance of kings in Israel. But I want you to be able to step back and get that impact. All right, so my goal for the day, it's in a couple of sentences this time. The first one being short. Kingship changes everything. Kingship changes everything. It is not just a form of government, a matter of scale, or prestige. It touches every idea of order and authority, including religion. Want me to read it again? Kingship changes everything. It is not just a form of government, a matter of scale or prestige. It touches every idea of order and authority, including religion. And one of the things to realize about the ancient world, and I don't know if this applies to you, if you think, oh, everything's fine, but in the ancient world, there was an intense awareness of how fragile life is, and it didn't take much to bring everything down. And that being the case, order was something that they really valued. And one of the biggest things that kings pushed was their ability to maintain order, not in some kind of autocratic, black-booted way, but as a positive thing that people needed. And so when kings wrote their royal inscriptions and boasted about their accomplishments, at the top of the list, it wasn't just, we won these battles, but when it comes to the life of their people, they'd say, we bring peace and stability and order. You will know tomorrow when you get up that things will be like they were today, that they'll be okay. So once kingship is out there, whether it's in Israel or whether it's in the ancient world more broadly, it affects the way they think about order, which is so important for everybody. Now, from here, this is the rest of the class. I want to start with this biblical text. A little bit again, so put the primary evidence out there first. This is 2 Samuel chapter 6. It's part of the story of David. And rather than describe what it is, we'll read it. But it is part of the story of what David does when he is king. And what I want you to get out of it is to start thinking again about the implications of having kings in Israel. And it's just a biblical story. It's not absolute, but it's a good place to start thinking. Then I have a section where I just want to with a lot of the rest of the class, I want to just put some basics out there to make sure you see where we are in the history of Israel and the development of Israel. So I wanted to talk about who are the kings and what are the kingdoms in Israel. And then finally, I'll kind of come back to the long chapter by Carol Myers. And I don't know if you had a chance to work through all of it. It's a fairly long chapter. One of the things I said at the beginning of the course is that, again, this is a book that's edited with different authors writing different articles. The qualities of the articles may vary. The abilities of the scholars may vary, even dare I say it. But the one by Myers is really good. And it's interesting because she's an archaeologist. She's not an historian or biblical scholar or something like that. She's somebody who's worked deeply with archaeological material itself. And she's more anthropologically oriented than some archaeologists. And what I mean by that is anthropologists are asking comparative questions, and they're always thinking about just the structure of things, how you think about human society and human relationships, and you can see that in the way she writes, or if you go back and look at it again, you can. And so she asks some kind of broad questions about how you think about society, how you think about states. It's way too much for me to cover, and I don't want to take a class session and walk you through everything in the article, but there are a few high points that I want to hit, and that I hope might help you a bit if you are trying to understand the chapter. Okay, so starting with the text. So here we go. It's pretty close to the beginning of David's reign. At the beginning of chapter 5, he is made king of Israel. There's a backstory to that, but you don't need to know it for now. Chapter 5, then, the first thing he does after he is made king of Israel is he captures a place called Jerusalem to be his capital, a familiar sounding name. But at the time, it wasn't all that famous, and it was not even clearly part of Israel. But David takes it over, and then he goes and fights a bunch of Philistines to make his throne secure. And then the next thing you hear is this, right? So all you know is he became king, he made a capital for himself, Jerusalem, and made sure everything was safe, and then you're told he did this. David again assembled all the picked men of Israel, 30,000 strong. Then David and all the troops that were with him set out from Baalim of Judah to bring up from there the ark of God, to which the name was attached, the name Lord of hosts enthroned on the cherubim. Anybody ever see Raiders of the Lost Ark? I know it's really old now. But it was an ark. It was supposed to be this ark, just to know. Right? So it's like a box that if you open it up, all sorts of things come out and they eat you up. At least that's what happened in the movie. But in this story, you don't have to open it to get blasted. Which, in a way, the whole Raiders of the Lost Ark thing came from this story, actually. Anyway, it's a big box. So they loaded the Ark of God onto a new cart. So whatever it is, it's got to be able to fit on a cart. It had been at this place, this out in the countryside. So they loaded it on a cart and conveyed it from the house of Abinadab, which was on the hill, whatever that is. And Abinadab's sons, Uzzah and Ahio, guided the new cart. They conveyed it from Abinadab's house on the hill, Uzzah walking alongside the ark of God, and Ahio walking in front of the ark. This is so that you know why one of them gets it and the other one doesn't. So it turns out it's better to be in the advance guard than the one walking alongside. Meanwhile, David and all the house of Israel danced before the Lord to the sound of all kinds of cypress wood instruments with lyres, harps, timbrels, sistrums, and cymbals. It'd be great if we all knew what sistrums were. But when they came to the threshing floor of Nakon, Uzzah reached out for the ark of God and grasped it, for the oxen had stumbled. What, you want the ark of God to fall on the ground? The Lord was incensed at Uzzah, and God struck him down on the spot for his indiscretion. There you go. Got to be careful when you're walking around the ark of God. And he died there beside the ark of God. David was distressed because the Lord had inflicted a breach upon Uzzah, and that place was named Perez Uzzah, as it is still called. It's actually kind of interesting, by the by, because we read a version of this in the graduate course I'm doing right now. And it translates, the first one, the Lord was incensed, and in this one, David was distressed. They actually both say they're mad. That's all. It's the same phrase. That God gets mad at Uzzah, and so David gets mad at God. I don't know why they had to change that. David was afraid of the Lord that day. He said, "How can I let the ark of the Lord come to me?" So David would not bring the ark of the Lord to its place in the city of David. Instead, David diverted it to the house of Obed-Edom the Gittite. The ark of the Lord remained in the house of Obed-Edom the Gittite 3 months, and the Lord blessed Obed-Edom and his whole household. So you don't want to touch the ark, but having it at home with you is a good thing. It was reported to King David, "The Lord has blessed Obed-Edom's house and all that belongs to him because of the ark of God." Thereupon David went and brought up the ark of God from the house of Obed-Edom to the city of David amid rejoicing. This is in Jerusalem, the city of David. When the bearers of the ark of the Lord had moved forward 6 paces, he sacrificed an ox and a fatling. David whirled with all his might before the Lord. David was girt with a linen ephod. Thus David and all the house of Israel brought up the ark of the Lord with shouts and with blasts of horn. As the ark of the Lord entered the city of David, Michal, daughter of Saul, this is one of David's wives, looked out of the window and saw King David leaping and whirling before the Lord, and she despised him for it. And so, anyway, that gets her in trouble later. But notice this one other part. They brought in the ark of the Lord and set it up in its place inside the tent which David had pitched for it. And David sacrificed burnt offerings and offerings of well-being before the Lord. When David finished sacrificing the burnt offerings and the offerings of well-being, he blessed the people in the name of the Lord of hosts. And he distributed among all the people, the entire multitude of Israel, man and woman alike, to each a loaf of bread, a cake made in a pan, and a raisin cake. Then all the people left for their homes. Okay, so you're allowed to go back and check what you missed as I was going along, but I wanted to give you a chance to linger. So here are my questions. What do you learn from this story alone about the impact of having kings on Israel, on early Israel? So just from this story, and again, I mean, the method to my craziness is I want you to think this way when you're writing your papers. Right? I want you to be digging in below the surface to think, what is there to learn here that's more than just what meets the eye? So that's why every class I'm building this in, right, that we take some time to look at some sort of evidence. So what do you see? What do you learn about the impact of having kings? There is stuff you can learn. Take a try. And you can request that you get to see the first page if you want to know again, but most of it's on this one. I could give you categories even. What do you learn about kings? Is it also obvious being king? Yeah? So, okay, so if I understood right, so the question is that does the blessing on this Obed-Edom's house have anything to do with David getting angry? Well, I mean, I don't know which way you're going, but you mean almost like God says, all right, you get mad at me, I'm going to be nice to him, or something like that. Yeah, so I mean, that's a nice line of thought. I suppose then my question, of course, is maybe it's hard for you to think, this is a story about a guy, and it's religion, and this ark. What's it telling us about kings? So I would take your question, right, and say, well, what does it tell you about kings that David feels like he can't bring the ark the rest of the way in, or something like that? Or like, so let's just stop. What is David doing? What's the ark I sort of evoked this old movie. Maybe you need more information. Like, what is the ark? Do you get the? What does it represent? Yeah.
I guess it's kind of like a representation of God as a whole, because there's some like stark.
It's like a representation of God. What were you going to say? Or
I was gonna say like maybe like it's almost like he's putting himself like equal to God kind of by having
Th-
the ark and stuff.
this is David? Okay, so let me hold that thought. Did you still want to go? Yeah.
Or like kind of like God like powers or something.
So he was going to. So the first comment was that it's like God's presence. Then the second observation was that it's saying something about David's power and associating himself with the ark. My question was, what is the ark? Like what? Yeah, so I mean, it's a little bit like the first observation, right? That somehow the presence of God is actually identified with this. Somebody else had her hand up. So, are there lots of arks, do you think? Are there lots of presences of God? Right? So, at least as you read this story, do you get the impression? I mean, it's not a crazy question, because in the polytheistic world, there were absolutely lots of statues of gods. And even any individual god would have a separate statue specially made for every holy place. So number one, it's a kind of a strange picture to need to move something that marks the divine presence from one place to another place, because why not just make a new one? But go ahead.
A few things. One is the statues exactly represent. I don't know if the statues represented. It just was kind of it's just represented an idea there. It wasn't exactly like here. We're saying it actually represents that God is somewhere there. It represents
So-
almost like a presence kind of.
Well, so, which in fact statues could do. But what it is interesting that this particular object, which is not a statue, number one isn't a statue, of course, but of course when he touches it, the guy gets blasted, right? So there really is this sense of power, which is along the line. Let me go ahead to hold it until we'll get another one. Go ahead.
I think, isn't he moving it because he's moving the capital to Jerusalem, so he's like moving
Right.
people and,
Okay.
like, the promise that God's made to his people to Jerusalem.
So now we're thinking politically, right? So which is this is good, and where I'm headed at least, right? So you've got this object that's associated with the presence of God, the power of God, that for whatever reason, at least the story treats it as if there's just one of them, like that this is not something that you can just get anywhere. And that's important, because if David's the king, and there's one of these things that is so important to having God with you, then he chooses, it's not already there in his capital, and he wants it there. And so, for one, he being a king appears to mean, or he's claiming the power, as the story has it, to be able to take this religious object that is so important and that's not in Jerusalem, and he just shanghais it, right? I mean, he just says, it's mine, we're moving it to Jerusalem, and what's anybody going to do about it?
On the same note, isn't that sort of like in respect to God and the God of his people? He's saying, well, if we're going to move, then we can't go there without it.
I mean, it can be taken in all respect. But I want you to see the power part, which is why I used the language I did, right? That yes, I mean, on another side, and the Bible treats it this way, they'll say, look, I mean, this is one of the things God likes about David, that David wants him there, right? And he's willing to stake a lot on the presence of God with him, where he rules. But of course, if you just think about it in terms of power, here are these other people innocently, taking care of this sacred object, and suddenly, David says, okay, thank you very much, your job's done, we'll bring it on to Jerusalem. And so, as a king, he has the power to do this, which a little bit reminds me of what you said. It doesn't make clear whether it's got the right or not the right, but he is associating his power with God's power by saying, all right, you're now going to be where my capital is. And that's a huge political statement, right? That you take what the story presents as the greatest religious power that there is, or religious isn't even quite the word, but religious institutionally in a way, but divine sacred power, object associated with that. And you say, we're going to have that live with me, the king, so that I've now got all that with me. What were you going to say?
I know it's kind of a long shot, but if you
Take
connect
it.
to the beginning of class in some way, that when God is considered girded with strength, the world stands firm, and the throne stands with strength, so that having God by his side, he kind of has, it implies he has more power and he's stronger.
No, this is a good line of thought. Yeah, this goes the direction I'm headed. And I guess one of the things to notice, this gets into stuff that we'll maybe get to later in the term, but I've just finished this book that's on ancient Israel, and I built it around this notion of distinguishing two kingdoms, the kingdom of Israel from the kingdom of Judah, which is going to be a theme as we get from this part of the course on. But the interesting thing is that at least for the first couple hundred years of its existence, aside from this whole Jerusalem thing, the kingdom of Israel did not actually have its major center of worship for the same God, Yahweh, at the same place as the capital. Right? They might have had some shrine or something like that, but there was no tradition that the center of political power, human sort of secular power, if you call it that, was in the same place as the center of the primary presence of God somehow. And in Jerusalem, David establishes this combination, which is really not automatic and carries a huge force, a little bit along the lines of what you said. Yeah, put the two side by side. Okay, one.
Well, I think he does have power, but at the same time, it takes him 3 months to move the ark. So
Okay.
it's like God is saying, you're a king, but I'm first. So it's like, especially when he says would not bring the ark, I think it should be David could not bring the ark.
Uh-huh. So this is an interesting, so the comment is that you see that David has, he says he's going to bring it, he brings it, then he stops because there's this disruption, and the disruption absolutely doesn't come from people saying, oh, don't do that. I mean, God himself intervenes, and then David decides, maybe I better not do it. Although even that decision is made unilaterally, right? I mean, God never says you can't do it, and nobody else tells David he can't do it. He just himself says, uh-oh, this looks dangerous. I think I won't do it. And then when he decides to do it, he gets information and he does it. But it is interesting to wonder if what sort of you can ask about the power of God, but if I ask you to think politically, is there any evidence in the story for David needing to persuade others, that this is a good thing, that God is in favor, that he is a fair representative of God? These would all be good questions to ask. Now let me just move forward. I didn't forget your other question, but I keep trying to spread around the conversation. Let me just run through a couple of observations of my own, things at least to notice, categories to notice. I have like 4 categories. The first is individual power versus what you might call collective power. That the king represents individual power. The individual ability to make a decision, or at least to drive a decision, that affects the group, that affects the people as a whole. And if you say, well, then what's the collective? Well, I mean, everybody comes here, right? They have this big festival. There is a whole people involved. It's called Israel in a certain line. And again, this is something we'll come back to, but Israel as a name even represents a political identity that's not defined by a king and a capital. It's defined by some kind of association, some kind of collaborative group. So with a king, you have an individual who is claiming power in leadership that's not automatically part of what it is to be Israel. Second category, Jerusalem as a capital. Before you have kings, you don't have a capital, right? What is a capital? It's either a city or at least fortress or some kind of built-up base that represents a center of institutional authority and power, perhaps bureaucracy, maybe symbolic prestige, especially if you have a temple there, place for God. One thing you might have noticed, did you see the temple that David built for the ark? It was a tent. So if you wanted to get a sense for what was going on there, yeah, you got a king, but he's not building any big, massive structure. The Bible associates that with Solomon, which is another very royal thing to do. But David doesn't go there. Number 3, just notice the royal initiative in religious affairs. That's a little bit like what you were talking about. But aside from just the king saying, okay, let's have this sacred object and put it right here by me, notice how he's the one telling the priests what to do. Right? All the orders come from the king. Did you notice it has David even making a sacrifice at one point? And David's the one that makes this allotment to all these people down here. They all get these kind of like offering, your little festival portion or whatever. And then finally, my 4th example kind of comes from that last line, which is, you don't see a lot of in this story, but it's one of the big issues for imagining kings on the scene, which is the concentration of wealth. The concentration of wealth. And so when it says that David makes these sacrifices and he distributed among all the people, the entire multitude of Israel, everybody, loaf of bread, all this stuff. What it's saying is that David is portrayed as being the chief financial sponsor of this feast. And that's not the normal way necessarily. I mean, you can have feasts where people share the burden, right? Share the financial burden. So when you have somebody who gives out all these gifts, they're festival gifts, it's already a reflection of the kind of centralization of wealth, concentration of wealth that goes with kings and kingship. And the Bible would never have had anything like this. I haven't checked, but I mean, if you go through the history from Joshua to Judges and so on, I mean, this would be the first example of some individual person saying, all right, I've got all the stuff, I'll give it to you. I'll allot it to you. This is what kings do. All right, so what I want you to see in this picture is the real power of kings. And so far as the goal of kings is to be permanent, to live out their lives as kings, and to bestow the title on their sons after them, then if they succeed, if they can pull it off, then the whole landscape changes once kings show up on the scene. So this gets me to the next part, which is who are the kings and what are the kingdoms? And for some of this stuff, I have to give you some information. It's a little bit of this was in Meyer's article. Some of it'll come up again, but I want you to just have a lay of the land. And there's 2 parts to this. One is what it would look like without the Bible, and the other is what it would look like in the Bible. The Bible has a very particular story, but again, thinking as historians, the Bible is this incredibly valuable, incredibly interesting resource, but it's one piece of evidence. It's compiled at a point that's much later than the dates of the events that it portrays. And so how do we judge its information, like what it knows and doesn't know? And again, just as historians, I want to be cautious. I want you to look for confirming evidence or denying evidence and weigh it all. So we'll start with what it would look like without the Bible. And I'll just hit the high points of the biblical part. It's not very complicated. So without the Bible, there would be two kingdoms. Without the Bible, there would be two kingdoms at the same time. And just that. Like if you only had the Bible, you would have Merenptah back in Egypt, if you remember, some reference to Israel. We don't know what he's talking about exactly. And then the next thing you'd know is you get to the 9th century, and you would have two kingdoms. So as far as you could tell from outside the Bible, Israel went from, I don't know, no kings, whatever they were, way back when, to being two kingdoms, or at least two kingdoms that end up being associated with each other, with the same God. One question could be whether the two kingdoms are part of the same operation. Like, why even talk about these two kingdoms any differently than a few other kingdoms who are in the neighborhood? And, well, one could argue about it from a non-Bible point of view. The Bible combines them. So here's how it works. The first evidence comes from the 9th century. Can you turn this off, and I'll use the board. Just to write down a couple of names. I think these are in Myers. They come from three places: Assyria, Moab, and northern Israel. Thanks. Drat. I didn't bring my marker. Is there one here?
Write on a Word document. I mean, if you want to.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Will it make permanent marks all over the board? Oh, thank you. Make sure I don't. It's funny because I got one and brought it in my briefcase, and then I thought, I don't want to carry the whole thing, and forgot that I'd need to write. Thank you. All right. So the first one is Assyria. All right. Can you read this? It's not as great as you want. Yeah, in the back.
I think I have a black one, actually.
He doesn't like your marker. Do you have a black? I'll spell it while we see what we can do.
Yeah.
Oh, this is wonderful. Thank you. Wing it. Just throw it. All right. Okay. If I can get the top off. Okay. Better. The well-equipped class. Assyria, and this is the major kingdom, ends up kind of running the whole place eventually. That's up in Iraq, pretty much, but takes over the whole Near East. And the king in particular is named Shalmaneser. That's why I figured I better write it. And he's Shalmaneser III. There have been other Shalmanesers before him. These names are even better in Akkadian. This is like a sort of Grecified version or something. But he comes from the early part of the 9th century, so this is like the 860, somewhere around there. But this is the oldest reference to the kingdom of Israel. And it's called Israel in the oldest text. But that's actually strange because in all of the Assyrian references to Israel over time, a couple hundred years, there are 20 or 30 of them. This is the only one where the name Israel is used. It's the only one. It's the oldest, and it's the only one where they use the name Israel. In the next later text, which is still Shalmaneser III, they call it the house of Omri, O-M-R-I. Omri is a known king of Israel from the Bible. He's the king who made this place called Samaria. So Samaria is... This became the capital, like the Jerusalem counterpart for Israel, this kingdom called Israel. It's farther north of Jerusalem. Omri is the guy who made Samaria the capital, according to the Bible. And the Assyrians end up calling the whole kingdom just the house of Omri. So that's number one. By the by, though, for the Assyrians, after these earliest set of texts where they use the term Israel and the house of Omri, they actually call this place Samaria. So all the time when they're dealing with this kingdom, they just call it Samaria. So when I told you that the name Israel is not, named for a king or a capital, that's a normal way to name a kingdom, right? And the Assyrians, they named theirs after Assyria, which is their Ashur, which is the capital. And Samaria is the capital of that kingdom. The Assyrians called it by the capital. Number 2. Can everybody see? Moab. Moab is the sort of southern part of modern Jordan that's on the other side of the Dead Sea from Israel. It's south of Amman, modern capital. And there was a king named Mesha. And this is usually called the Mesha inscription. It's this amazing text because there's so few such things. It was this monument that this king put up. It even mentions the name of Israel's God, and it mentions Israel, and it mentions Omri, but it mentions Israel. It might mention another kingdom, which might, if the reading is correct, be called the House of David. But it's in a very broken part of the text, and it's a little unsure. The reason why someone suggested that it might be that is that there is one more reference. But by the by, then this Mesha inscription is from 840, something like that, a little later 9th century. And then there's an inscription from a place in far northern modern Israel called Tel Dan. It's in Aramaic and was put up by the king of Damascus, which was the center of an Aramean kingdom. So the Arameans were kind of competitors to Israel in Syria. And in this text, there's reference to Israel and something called the House of David. And there are two kingdoms. So I'm holding on to this. Make sure you get it back, the marker. Okay, so you with me? So this is maybe from 830 or something like that. So in the 9th century, we have 3 different references or sets of references from Assyria, from Moab to the east, and from northern Israel, but actually on what would have been part of a monument set up by the king of Damascus, boasting that he conquered these people. The one other detail to put into this pile of evidence from outside the Bible is that the name Judah only appears in the late 8th century. The first non-biblical reference to Judah is from the late 8th century, so like 730, something like that. And again, that's this kingdom. It's the more southern kingdom. It appears to be, although we should be cautious, I suppose, it appears to be the same thing as the House of David was in this oldest text. So to get this right then, we don't have any evidence outside the Bible saying what's going on, say in the 10th century. David, Solomon, not mentioned outside the Bible. So the earliest reference to kingdoms outside the Bible come from the 9th century. And at first they mention just one kingdom, which is called Israel, or the house of Omri, or eventually Samaria. But pretty early on, you have this text from Tel Dan, which is only 30 years later, that mentions another kingdom, which is called the House of David. And then, 100 years later, is finally called Judah. And this is what we would know without the Bible. Any question? Is this surprising at all? It's interesting, yeah?
So the House of David would refer to the southern kingdom, and the House of Omri would refer to the northern kingdom?
Yeah, so one interesting pattern that he sort of catching, right, if you look at this, is, there's more than one name, of course, used for these kingdoms. But he is noticing that if you look at this house language, then we have evidence for the northern of the two kingdoms being called the house of Omri at one point, somehow treating Omri as the founder or something, and then at one point, the southern one of these two being called the house of David, as if David's the founder. And so, when this inscription was found, which was only in the early 1990s, it's a pretty recent thing, it's kind of a big deal, because it was by far the earliest reference to David as a person. And as I've said, there's no evidence for David as a king or Solomon as a king outside the Bible. Here's a reference to David. But if you had it on its own, you could think, well, what was he the king of? He must have been the founder of the southern kingdom, right? You wouldn't know that there was anything else going on. Go ahead.
Without the Bible, how would we know that Teldan and the House of Omri and the House of David are all the same kingdom? How do they connect them?
Well, so if you said outside the Bible, how would you make these connections between, say, Omri, or the house of Omri, the house of David? Well, so what I'm saying is that they would not appear to be the same kingdom. They would appear to be two different kingdoms. Yeah, so what you'd have is the thing called Israel. You'd have sort of Israel equals house of Omri equals Samaria. That's one kingdom. And then you'd have house of David equals Judah. At least as another kingdom, not necessarily at the same time. Mario will get into this at some point. But yeah, so that's what I want you to see, is this sort of without the Bible business. And that without the Bible, you wouldn't automatically get the notion that there was anything kind of before this. Like the Bible has this whole story of there having been one kingdom and it split. But that's only in the Bible. And it might be, something like that may be true. I think it was true. But it's, in order to be careful, you wouldn't know. Okay, so then I say, what's different about the Bible? So I'm going to approach this in a little different way, trying to be useful in the way I talk about this biblical stuff. First thing to notice, according to the Bible, the origin of monarchy is understood only as Israel. So a little bit I'm kind of combining this Bible stuff with the non-Bible stuff, right? So I said, outside the Bible, evidence for two kingdoms. The Bible agrees there were two kingdoms. But what the Bible is telling you is monarchy originated in just one of them, called Israel. And it's called Israel, outside the Bible even. The one that's not Judah and not the house of David. Second point, according to the Bible, a separate southern kingdom split off in the late 10th century. And I'm actually taking the liberty of giving it an exact date because I think I mentioned before that there's this very specific, detailed chronology of the two kingdoms that really holds up historically. And if you measure it back from dates that you can establish based on, Babylonians and whatnot, then it would take you back to the late 10th century. I'm going to close this. Okay. All right, so the Bible portrays a southern kingdom splitting off from Israel in the late 10th century. And it gives you two names. Where Rehoboam is the son of Solomon, and he ends up being the king of this offshoot in the south that's not called Israel. And Jeroboam becomes the new king of Israel. And then one more fact the Bible would give you, which is that there are 3 kings over Israel before the split. And these you'll probably have heard of, especially the first two because your paper was on them. Saul and David, and then David's son Solomon. Now, just the thing to watch out for is that only the Bible says that this is the case, that there were these three kings before the split. We don't have any other outside evidence to demonstrate it. And the other funny detail is that the oldest Saul stories, and again, this is a kind of judgment call, but the oldest material about Saul in the Bible appears not to call him king. Or another way to put this is that Saul's identification as a king in the Bible is deeply tied up with David's identification as a king. So as an historian, if you think, it's the people who were talking about David who wanted to make good and sure that you thought of Saul as a king. So the other question you can ask, and this reminds me of the comment early in the class, how do you know when you first have a kingdom? With this kind of sliding scale. Well, how do you know even in the biblical story, who's a king? What makes somebody a king? Well, in Hebrew, there's a word for king, so that certainly helps, except for these are stories about these characters. So how do you know, if you were in their own time, who was calling themselves a king and who could claim it and hold it? And in fact, we know from non-biblical evidence that this was a big deal, these titles. And it was a big deal to lay claim to that title and be acknowledged as one. And that was what made you a king, was that you could claim the name and keep it. All right? So this is it. This is the biblical stuff. So now I've got a few minutes left to look at Myers. And again, Myers is an archaeologist. The second paper will give you a chance to get a real feel for the archaeological evidence in a way that even her article won't. But here's just some really basic information to orient you. And I've got 4 categories. Even if I just get through the first 2 or 3, we're all right. So the first has to do with chronology. So here's this archaeologist talking about, the beginning of Kings. But what gives her the right to say she knows anything, right? I've already put out there for you the written evidence. There's non-biblical written evidence, and there's the stuff in the Bible. But like I said, what's a king? It's a Hebrew word or a word in another language that would be the word for king. It's almost meaningless unless you have the language, unless you have the text, words. What are the names? Like Saul, David, Solomon. How do you know that these people are there or anything's going on? Or Omri, or only if you have text, right? So you have the Bible gives you this as stories, and you have other texts that give you at least other names of people a little bit later. So if you're just an archaeologist and you're working away on artifacts and digging up stones from old cities, but you don't have any writing, then how do you know? How do you know what the date is? How do you know you're even at the time when you would be looking at David or Solomon? Well, so they've thought about these things, don't worry. But the answers aren't always obvious. So the first category that you have to catch, which is so crucial in any discussion about the beginning of Kings, is chronology. And there are 2 terms I'm going to toss out there for you: relative and absolute. So relative chronology is chronology that can only be determined without reference to any fixed dates. So for instance, in Egypt or Mesopotamia, there are lists of kings. And in Mesopotamia, at least by a certain point, they began to take very precise astronomical observations where, for instance, they would notice a solar eclipse, which we can still date. So if you can find that solar eclipse and the reference to it in some late-ish Babylonian, astronomical diary, and then you think, oh, we have a list of kings that goes back 500 years from then, then you can count 500 years backwards from that eclipse in real time, like date, and well, that's absolute chronology. Right? There's my other that's my other category. That's absolute chronology. Relative chronology is when you can't do that. You have some sense of what comes before or after what else, but you can't be precise. And the major way in which relative chronology is determined in this part of the world is through ceramics or pottery. And the story is that they use pottery for everything. You know, cookware, storageware, eating utensils, but it's, you know, I mean, and they let it fall, and they swept some of it away, and they put it in pits, and if a house was destroyed in a war and an earthquake or a fire or something like that, then the roof collapsed with all the stuff there on the ground. People would be buried with the stuff, nicer stuff. You find either whole pots if you're lucky in graves or things like that, or you know, you find potsherds all over the place. Everywhere you look, there's pottery. And the thing about pottery styles is that they change. And if you look at the whole repertoire of everything they use, from storage pots to, you know, cups to, you know, bowls and things like that, through time, you see the styles change. You know, the rim flares out a little here. They decide to start painting them there. You know, they change the materials, a little thicker, a little thinner. They get better at it. And when you examine these through space and time, you can begin to build a kind of a grid for a relative chronology, so that when you find any given selection of pottery, you sort of place it on the grid, and you think, oh, it's closest to about here. We're probably within about 40 years of such and such. And this is how a lot of dating of stuff in the ancient world has to work. Because if you don't have texts, or you don't have, you know, some pharaoh's, you know, name tag or something like that, I won't get a cartouche on a seal or something like that, you don't know. You don't know when you are, in a sense, right? You don't know the date. So here then are a couple of the broad categories for these relative chronologies, and this is where the Bronze Iron Age thing comes in. It's based on these relative chronologies. The ones that matter for you are the Late Bronze Age. So the Late Bronze, which is the end of the Bronze Age, is usually dated from about 1550 to 1200. And then there's the Iron Age. And the part that we've done so far is the Iron Age 1. You read about this stuff, which has been dated roughly from 1200 to 1000. And then the Iron Age 2 varies depending on people's schemes, but it covers the rest of Israel and Judah, the time of kings. And the Iron Age 2A is this first period of kings, evidently. But there is a huge debate about how to relate these to absolute chronology that was started by Israel Finkelstein, who you're going to read attempting to tear apart Abraham Faust in your second paper. And Israel Finkelstein proposed in 1996, 1997 that everything had been in the middle part of Israel's history, or the earlier to middle part, that everything had been dated almost 100 years too old. So that when people thought they were digging up stuff that belonged to Solomon, they were really digging up stuff that belonged to Ahab, more or less, or Omri. You know, that, I don't know if that makes sense. Like if you thought you were digging up the time of David, you were really after the split. You know, and you were, instead of the 10th century, you're in the 9th century. And so that a huge debate ensued. You would have thought they could settle it. And it's moved a bit. It's shifted over 15 years, but they're still duking it out. It'd be very interesting to see what it looks like in another 10. They don't agree. So, I mean, the last thing then to say in terms of the archaeology, and then I'll leave you with Myers, is that the period we'd be talking about today is the Iron 2A. And of course, then this is this huge argument, because either the Iron 2A by the conventional year chronology would be the 10th century, and the stuff you find there would be David and Solomon. Or if Finkelstein is right, and there are a bunch of people who think he is, then it's just irrelevant. It's not the same time. The stuff you find in Iron 2A is from the early period of the two kingdoms. And if you wanted to know about David and Solomon, if they existed, you'd have to go back to the Iron 1, and the whole landscape would be simpler, not so many bigger buildings and bigger cities and stuff like that, and you'd have, oh yeah, it's David, he's like a local chieftain or something like that. All right? So Myers goes on in this vein, but there's a little bit of a sense of what the big issues are. See you next time.